Hello, everyone. I'm Mark Birdie, CEO and founder of the Content Marketing Plaza, bringing you some insights on how you can crush it with a podcast interview. We are going to cover the host standpoint, so the person who is actually organizing the interview. We will cover the guest and how to crush that interview in a future Facebook Live. But going into how we can crush these interviews as the hosts of our own podcasts, we really want to start off with the introduction. And the introduction is easily the most important part of any interview. And in this introduction, you want to introduce yourself, welcome the audience, and then introduce the guest. So one thing to do though, when you introduce yourself, don't say, hi, and then you say your name. Instead, you want to slip in a credential. One of the things people forget is to highlight their own expertise on their own podcast. So I say, hello, everyone. I'm Mark Birdie, CEO and founder of the Content Marketing Plaza. That is very different from just saying, hello, I'm Mark Birdie. And by mentioning the Content Marketing Plaza, it puts that business in the listener's frame of mind. So when they hear it enough times, they not only associate me with breakthrough success, but they also associate me with the Content Marketing Plaza. So in that intro, for your part, make sure you have one little tidbit in there, whether you want to mention you are a best-selling author or you are a blogger or anything that you can mention in there, make sure you mention it. Then you introduce the topic. You want to basically, in this moment, tell listeners what the promise is of the episode. So let's say the topic is how to write your own book. Well, you want to emphasize why that's important and what you get out of it. So if that were me doing the episode, I would say something like this. Writing a book is something that so many people want to do. And about 80% of people say they want to be an author, but then why is it that only 2% of people become an author? And we know that writing books is helpful because it boosts your authority, it can make revenue, it can get you on speaking stages, do so many different things for you, but it's hard to actually write that book. So in this episode, we're going to talk about how to do just that. So you see in that intro, I basically explained why it's valuable to have your own book, some of the benefits, and then we say, okay, you heard all those different benefits. This is why it's actually important to write the book. Now, I'm saying that in this episode, you're going to learn how exactly do you write that book. And finally, you introduce the guest. And this is all just the intro. So you say today's guest. You don't say, let's say you have me on your show. You don't say Mark Birdie is CEO and founder of Content Marketing Plaza and then read the rest of my bio. You say today's guest is the CEO and founder of Content Marketing Plaza. You always start with today's guest and you don't mention the person's name until you welcome them to the show. So that's something that I do in all of my episodes now. I will not say the name of the guest until I say like, so-and-so, welcome to the show. That is when I actually mention the person's name first. Now, obviously, people can see in the title of the episode who is going to be on that show, and it's good to have that person's name in there because if you speak with someone like, someone really influential in your niche, listeners will be like, wow, that person's on the show. I have to listen to that episode. So it's definitely good to mention the person's name in the title of the episode, which is standard practice, but you don't want to mention their name right away. Use that today's guest for the initial part. So now that we're done with the intro, notice we covered a lot of ground there because the intro is vital to having a successful episode. It is the make or break for your podcast. Now we talk about the questions. And every single podcast, it seems like, always starts with a basic get to know you kind of a question. Mine is like, what's your background? How'd you start your journey? And this just gives listeners an idea of who they are listening to, and it gives them that valuable backstory. So that's the question that you always start with. The rest of it, that middle part, is where things get a little specific based on the topic you're covering. In my experience, if you are just starting out, it is good to come up with a bunch of questions in advance. Now, I say that with a little caution. You don't want to come up with, let's say, 8 questions in advance and ask them in order. You don't want to be question 2. Here the person's answer. Okay, great insight. Question number 3. Okay, great insight. Question number 4. You don't want to do that because you can miss an entirely new direction to the conversation. So it's good to have those questions in the beginning, to write down, to have all those questions, because if you're just starting out, you want to have a lot of preparation so you do better in the conversation. But when you get more established, like you're maybe 20 episodes in or 50 episodes in, and you feel more confident in your ability to just carry a conversation, then you have to say, okay, I have to ask 3 to 5 questions about this topic. So instead of writing down the questions, you write down, this is the topic that we need to focus on. And the reason that is vital is because now you are forced to engage in an unscripted conversation. This isn't you ask a question about, let's say, writing a book. We'll go back to there. Let's say you ask a question about writing an outline, and the person on your show mentions something amazing that like you have never heard of before. Let's say it's something like create 5 outlines and do 5 books at the same time, something like that, which is actually something that I do. We could cover that in like another Facebook Live, but let's say it's something about creating 5 outlines, and you've been like you've never heard something like that. So instead of going into your next question, how do I find the time to write books? Maybe you ask the question instead, wow, 5 outlines at the same time. I mean, how do you pick which one to focus on first? Why 5? Does that take you away from being able to really focus and master one book? How can we, there's so many different follow-up questions that you can ask instead of going into that next question, how do I find the time for this one book? So that's why I don't write as many questions anymore. And that's something that you should do as you get more experience, because then the conversation carries out naturally. And it definitely does take less time to prepare if instead of coming up with a bunch of different questions, you say, okay, I have to ask 3 to 5 questions about this topic based on how the conversation flows. The best conversations, they never feel like Q&A. Like the conversation you have with your friends, for instance, a friend who you really like talking with, those aren't Q&As. Those are just stuff that comes up on the fly, stuff that comes up based on what they said, active listening, and then asking the right question based on what was said. So that's my insight on writing the questions. The key thing being let the conversation flow. Now, one thing that I do in any interview, whether it's a summit interview or an interview on breakthrough success, I always ask a few of the same questions over and over again. And the question that I think I've asked on every single episode, maybe even the initial ones, is something to the effect of, what do you believe holds most people back from unlocking their full potential? And the reason a question like that, I ask that to everyone, is because there's so many different answers to that one question. Fear is an answer that I get very often for that question, but these are the types of questions where no matter who you ask, it's going to provide value. It's appropriate for the conversation, because I could make a variation of that question. What do you believe holds most people back from writing their own book? So I can change that question based on the subject being discussed. In some cases, you should test asking different kinds of questions. One of the questions I asked a lot was, what is one of the big challenges that you face in your journey and the powerful lesson you learned during that challenge? I asked that question for at least, I would say 200 episodes, but then I changed that, because I figured out when people introduce themselves, sometimes they hit on that big challenge. So I don't want to ask that question again, because they already talked about their big challenge, and challenges, they're just a natural part of the conversation for my episodes. So instead, I ask them, what habits do they say are essential for their success? So that's a question you can ask anyone and get a lot of different great insights from. So it's good to have some questions that you always use. This can also help if, in some cases, this is definitely less likely as you do more of these interviews, but in some cases you can't think of that follow-up question soon enough. So then you go a little quicker to that success habit question, or the question that you have that you're going to ask every guest. It's always good to have at least 2 to 3 of these questions, because asking the right questions gets a lot of great answers. If you find the question that really works and it could be applied to a lot of people, if not everyone on your show, definitely ask that question. So now we've got into the conversation, which after these answers, you should be providing value. It's not, thank you for that great answer. Let's move on to the next question, or let's move on to this next part of the conversation. If you have that conversational flow, you should support the guest's answer, because listeners, they do want to hear what the guest has to say, but they also want to hear what you want to say. You are that person who they trust. And if you take the time to provide your expertise, provide that value. So let's say that, going back to this example of an author teaching you how to write your book, the author says something like, you can market your book on Amazon using Kindle Direct Publishing, and you can make a free promotion, something like that. And I say, well, that's definitely a great tactic. One thing you could do to go a step further is get your book on Audible, publish it as an audiobook, because that is a growing segment. It especially helps if you have a podcast, because listeners on podcasts like to listen to audiobooks. They like to learn by listening to audio content. So in that case, I'm adding value to the valuable answer the guest already provided. You want to do that to demonstrate your expertise throughout the episode. So now that we have the question part covered, we finally hit the conclusion. We hit the part where the guest basically talks a little bit about where to find them, but you don't initially start by saying, where can we find you on the web, or that kind of a question. What you do instead is say something like, I'm going to use myself as the example again with the Plaza. Thank you so much for coming on the show. If you guys want to learn more about Mark, head over to Content Marketing Plaza. That will be in the show notes. But in addition to the Plaza, Mark, where else can we find you on the web? So you mentioned one of the key places that your listeners can find your guests on the web. It's good if you promote their offer. So if they have like a landing page, an opt-in page, depending on what you want to call it, promote that if that is their preference. I always, in my Acuity scheduling form, I will ask the guest what page they want me to promote. So I will promote that at the end and then say, where else can we find you in addition to that page, which will be in the show notes. So that's pretty much how you deliver a great interview experience with you as the host. A lot of our time was focused on the intro. That was intentional, because the intro is really make or break. If you are not enthusiastic in the intro, if it does not come off as strong, listeners will look for another podcast. There are more than enough options available. Your intro has to hook them right from the start. And then we go into the questions, as we talked about before. The key is to focus on having a conversation, and then the conclusion, where you promote the guests a little bit, then they promote themselves a little bit. You give them that plug, and that's essentially what it takes to have a quality interview. Now, if you guys want to learn more about podcasting, because I know we just talked about one part, there's so much more, but the key things people want to do are launch a podcast if they don't have one, grow their podcast, and monetize it so they're making a profit. If you are interested in those things, I have a great event for you called the Profitable Podcasting Summit, 100% free and virtual. So there's no traveling expenses, no anything like that. So if you want to be a part of that, if you want to be an attendee for that, head over to profitablepodcastingsummit.com. That is also in the description of this video. I greatly appreciate you taking the time to watch this video. And what I want you to do today, tomorrow, and every day after that is to dream big, achieve greatness, and unlock your potential today.